My name is Julie Steele. I am the programs director here at Loudoun Habitat for Humanity. We want to welcome you to today's virtual workshop for the Tools for Life Learning Center. Our topic today is your guide to planting perennials in the fall. We've got a wonderful guest speaker joining us today, because this is certainly an area I am not an expert in, but I am looking forward to learning more today, and I know that you are as well. Before I introduce our speaker, let's talk a little bit about our goals for today. So we are going to talk about the differences in the definition between an annual and a perennial. I know that this is something that many people are often confused about, so we'll clarify that. We'll talk about why we plant perennials and how to plan your garden, what to plant, some basic care of your garden, when you should plant your perennials, and where to get them, which I think is great. Some great tips that are coming your way in today's workshop. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. This is Carol Ivory. She is a master gardener with the Loudoun Cooperative Extension. Carol, like all of the master gardeners at the Cooperative Extension, they focus on the mission of providing education and training for environmentally safe horticultural practices. And so Carol will do a much better job explaining what that is, and we're really looking forward to hearing her presentation today about perennials and how to plant them. So welcome, Carol.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, before we, I'm going to actually hand it over to you, but before we do that, throughout today's presentation, if you do have any additional questions beyond those that people started sharing at the very beginning, please put those into the chat. Let us know. We'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of today's presentation. So with that, Carol, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, so let's go over what's an annual and what's a perennial. And actually, it depends on where you live. Because if you live in Florida or perhaps in Georgia, I'm not sure about that, but certainly it's true in Florida. Many of these plants that we consider annuals in Virginia die at the end of the year because of the cold weather. And that's the only reason they die. And if they had warm weather year round, they would live year round. So to a great extent, it all depends on where you live. But we're all here in Virginia. So annuals grow from seed to a mature plant, and they just bloom their little hearts out all summer long. They produce as much seed as they can, and then when the weather starts to change, they die, and that's the end. So they complete their entire life cycle in just one growing season. Now, some of these flowers can reseed themselves, but often that's not very successful, and that's especially true if they're a hybrid, that the little seeds that come up next year, they might not be true to color. They might look a little different, and they'll be getting a slower start than those annuals that you buy in the garden center or the big box store every spring. So you do kind of start all over again with annuals, but they really do reward you with beautiful flowers all year long. Now, some annuals you might really prize. I take my geraniums inside, some of them, because they're in pots, and I bring them inside, and I either put them in a sunny window, or I'll put them under some grow lights, and then I've got a mature plant again the next year that I can put outside. You need to prune them back some so they've got new healthy bushy growth, but you can certainly keep some of those annuals over the winter. I've even kept, in my crazier days, some impatiens, just sort of snip them off, root them again in water, keep them all winter long, and put them back out. If you've got an impatiens that is a particularly wonderful color that you like, you can't always you can't always get them the next year, or at least first thing the next year. There's a question about herbs. What was that question? I can take that. Julie,
So, yes, so the question about herbs is, do you bring your herbs inside during the winter? How do you prune geraniums?
Nothing fancy about pruning geraniums. You just like cut them back so they're short, they're round. You cut off those big scraggly branches. You really can't hurt a geranium. Leave some leaves on so that it can photosynthesize and feed the roots. Just prune them back. Don't stress over it. Herbs, I'm not the herb lady. You might want to Google that. Depending on what kind of herbs you have, most of them do come back. I've got mint that comes back year over year. I know friends that have, rosemary, even parsley comes back. You leave it outside. And then you just it will, the parsley, if you put it up close to your door, and kind of if it's going to be really, really cold, cover it up, because you can use it all winter long. I don't know if I've answered that very well, but I think the herbs you generally keep outside because some plants really need the winter. They need to be cold. So especially any native plant, they need to winter outside. People feel sorry for their plants in the winter, but the plants are going through their normal life cycle in the winter. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Next. Okay, perennials, they survive from year to year. They prosper, they reproduce, and however, what they don't do is that they don't have a very long blooming period. So they die just above the ground or below the ground with the onset of winter weather, and sometimes even early fall. Plants have different sensitivities to temperatures and die off at different times. And then in the spring, they regenerate themselves and they grow. Often, if everything's going well and they're happy where they are and they've had a good year, the previous year, they've gotten a lot of sun, they will grow larger and larger every year. Now, perennials don't have the same strategy for survival as annuals do. Annuals just, like I said, they bloom their hearts out all summer long. They produce as many seeds and then they die. But perennials have only a bloom period of about 4 to 6 weeks. I'm sorry, we all want them to grow prolifically and to bloom their little hearts out all summer long, but they don't. They have to store their energy to live all winter long. They have to keep their vegetative parts underground alive all winter long. So they can't expend the energy to bloom all winter long. They expend they have to store up that energy to feed their living parts all winter. So they have two strategies for reproducing. So in addition to flowering and producing seed, they also have some way of reproducing vegetatively. We know that bulbs will divide. There are tubers, like irises have tubers, and and those get bigger and longer, and you can divide them. And others just they'll produce multiple crowns. They'll have rhizomes. They will send out runners. Think about strawberry plants, and a lot of native plants have that same strategy of sending out a runner and producing more roots and a new plant. So they reproduce vegetatively just in case they have a bad seed season. So they do have two strategies for reproducing, and the vegetative one is the most reliable method for most plants. So anyway, let me see now. So let's take a look. Up here at the upper left-hand corner, there's Virginia bluebells, and then there's a variety of bulbs. And don't forget, we also have things like the snowbells, which will bloom very early. They'll come up and bloom in February. And then we've got the crocus that kind of come next, and then all the daffodils. And then the next one, that white one, is a penstemon, however you want to pronounce it. It's like the foxglove and those plants. And you've got cone flowers down in the lower left-hand corner. There is the red bee balm. Bee balm comes also in more of a blue or purple color. In addition to that red, there are different varieties. Then the next one is milkweed, which we all need to have if we want monarch butterflies. Milkweed's very important. There are various varieties of milkweed. Then the next one is the black-eyed Susans, and then asters. And the asters are probably the latest ones. They kind of look like mums, right? So they are our fall bloomers. What I don't have shown is goldenrod. There are a wide variety of goldenrods, and I hope everyone knows that goldenrod does not cause allergies. It's the ragweed that causes the allergies. Goldenrod has very, very heavy pollen. It doesn't blow in the air at all. And the bees love it, and the birds like it, and they need those late blooming flowers to live, to make it through the winter. So if you want color all year long in your garden, this is kind of hard, takes some thought and planning, but you need to have a different kinds of flowers. Now, the Virginia bluebells, all those little spring ephemerals, and the bulbs, they bloom and then they die off and totally disappear. And you can have all these other plants planted among these spring blooming plants. But you do need to kind of stage your garden. Probably some of the longer blooming ones are the black-eyed Susans and the coneflowers, but they're still not going to bloom all summer long. Okay, next. Okay, so why would we want to plant perennials? Well, once you get them established, there's much less work. And because you don't have to replace them every year, there's less cost. I mean, like in some cases, no cost. I have some perennial beds that I don't touch. They are well established. The plants are growing close together. I have to do just a little bit of weeding, but because there's very little soil exposed anymore, there's very few weeds, and they just grow. The only thing I need to remember to do is spray them with deer repellent. I have a lovely bed, normally a lovely bed of coneflowers, and this year, I don't know what happened. I just forgot to spray them, and the deer came in and just ate them down. And so the usually beautiful bed isn't beautiful this year. I did go out and spray, and they're starting to come back, but you do have to protect your plants from the various wildlife that eats them. Okay, so the root systems hold the soil, they enrich the soil, they hold the moisture that all prevents erosion, and and very important to all of us, I hope, is that these perennials offer food and shelter for wildlife. Many of the perennials, try to get native perennials. You want to get milkweed for the monarch caterpillar, which is that second caterpillar in there. And they will strip all the leaves off your milkweed, and then those leaves grow right back. So the caterpillars are not hurting the milkweed. They've evolved that way over thousands, perhaps millions of years. They're accustomed to being together and supporting each other. I don't know exactly what the monarch does for the milkweed, but I bet they do something because the milkweed is very resilient and comes back even after it's been totally munched down by those caterpillars. And then the caterpillars, turn into the butterflies, and it's just so rewarding. All of our birds eat the seeds that grow on these flowers. The most common one that really entertains me no end is the little goldfinch that will sit on the black-eyed Susans and the coneflowers and feed all the time. They're beautiful. On the right-hand side, there is a moth, a hummingbird moth, which is like a really, really strange looking butterfly. It really does look like a little bird of some kind. It's wonderful. Okay, next. All right, we want to talk a little bit about zones. Loudoun County is zone 6B to 7A, and every plant has hardiness zones. But for perennials, and especially for native perennials, if you can buy them around here, they'll grow. And this is a very, very tolerant range. And especially where we're in the Piedmont, we're right sort of in the middle of the mid-Atlantic, and we have a greater variety of plants than anywhere else in the United States. I just spent a week in Alaska, and the plants and everything are beautiful, but they really have very few, a very small variety. I mean, it's kind of dumbfounding. I didn't see a single oak. I would suggest that you wait until early winter to really cut back your coneflowers. Depending on how many flowers you have, you might want to deadhead some of them, but leave the others. You want to leave them for the birds, and also so that they reseed, because you want your coneflowers to have they want them to really cover the soil, provide that protection to the soil, and also to keep out the weeds. When you plant, more important than zone, because everything grows in Virginia everywhere, pretty much. What you have to be careful of is whether the plant likes moisture or doesn't like moisture. So if you have a spot that's often damp, make sure you plant things there that will tolerate the wetness, or the roots will rot. Coneflowers are very fussy, and they don't like to be wet for long periods of time. They will die. Other plants really like a lot of moisture, and they like more moisture really realistically than you can really provide them through watering. So there are some plants that like moisture that you don't want to plant in a dry spot. It's just a losing battle. So be careful about sun and about moisture. Don't try to plant a sun-loving plant in a spot that's mostly shady. They just won't make it. Okay, next. Okay, this gives you an idea of how to keep color in your garden all year round. the spring bulbs and the spring ephemerals, I love Virginia bluebells, and they really will grow anywhere. They totally die off by the beginning of June. There's no trace of them. So you can plant them with ferns, you can plant them with almost anything. Um, and when they die off, then the other plant is starting to go full speed ahead. The early summer, you've got Coreopsis, penstemon, columbine, and irises. Then midsummer, there's bee balm, coneflower. This is when they're blooming, black-eyed Susans. Now, by midsummer, these plants will have all made an appearance by at least by late spring and be growing. So they will have a presence in your garden. They just won't bloom until midsummer. And then in late summer, you've got goldenrod, asters, blue mist. The blue mist comes up really late. And it's this little, it's a native plant, and like a lot of native plants, it's not, it's hard to control. It reseeds itself, it wanders around. It's just charming. It's blooming now, and it's a very pretty blue. If you're accustomed to the ageratum, which is an annual, this is like a native ageratum. It's taller, but the flower is same sort of flower, blue mist. So perennials are a bit more of a challenge to keep things blooming in the garden, and there's often sort of this dead spot in the middle of the summer where things just aren't blooming. You've got beautiful foliage, but not a lot of blooms. Okay, next. So, what to plant? Really, there are so many different varieties of plants, and I haven't even mentioned the non-natives, the shade-loving hostas. They're lovely. The deer agree that they're lovely and delicious. So if you have hostas, you absolutely must spray them. Hostas are a good demonstration of what happens when the plant doesn't have enough energy to make it through the winter. Because if the deer come in early to midsummer and eat all the leaves off your hosta, they don't grow back. And then they've had their source of photosynthesis and energy eaten away by the deer, and you do that for a couple years in a row, and the hosta are gone. You'll never see them again. They just don't have the energy to come back. So you do need to take into account, do you have deer, and do you have the time and discipline to spray regularly a deer repellent? Otherwise, they will eat some of your plants, so they're gone. So what do you like? What plants do you like? And then you've got to consider, do you have the amount of light and moisture that suits that plant? Don't try to make something succeed in a spot that it doesn't really, isn't really suited to that plant. And then, what's available to you to get. And then this is really important, your space. How big is that grown plant going to be? We've got a lot of native plants that grow to be 5, 6, 7 feet tall. They aren't really front yard plants. They're great plants in a meadow, in a field. Most of us don't have meadows and fields. You might just have a container by your front door, and hostas grow great in containers. Many plants, you need a big container that will survive during the winter. I often move my containers back against the fence and bury them in leaves to protect them. Um, and glazed pots survive multiple winters very well. The clay pots, after a few winters, usually start to break, crack, crumble. The unglazed clay pots don't really weather multiple winters very well. So what is the size that you want to plant? And I always say start small and succeed. Success is great. So if you are successful with just a few plants next year, it'll spur you on to either try other plants or continue planting that same plant. So let's look at the next slide. Basic care of perennials. Remember, even though you can't see them, most of them have disappeared. They are there. They're there all winter long to store energy, living on stored energy. So to help them conserve their energy, you want to deadhead some of the spent flowers. As I said before, save some for the birds. You want to maintain the foliage until it dies off naturally. This is true even of the foliage that very often we will want to cut off to clean up the yard, like the daffodil leaves. After they've bloomed, the leaves get all floppy. Don't cut them back. I know it looks messy, and don't tie them all up and wrap them around, because you need to get the sun to those leaves until they actually die, because that's feeding the bulbs. And you've got to feed those bulbs to have good flowers the next year. When it gets dry, even in the winter, it's good to water as long as the ground isn't frozen, because the plants, the roots and the bulbs and the tubers that are under the ground need that water. You want to protect the soil with a layer of, I like leaf mulch. And if you're living here in Virginia, even if you don't have trees, I bet there are other people in the neighborhood who have trees, and I have been known to go and get other people's bags of leaves that they've put out on the curb and use as mulch for my plants. If you have a lawnmower, you want to run over those leaves with your lawnmower. You want to break them up as much as possible. That way, they won't blow, they'll lie flat, and they will decompose faster. When I moved here, I did move here over 30 years ago, and I just had clay in my front yard. And year after year after year, I just put down leaf mulch every year, and now I've got the greatest soil. It is wonderful. I'd have to dig down about 6 inches to find the clay. So you do want to enrich your soil with organic material. Now, I saw there was a question there about fertilizing perennials. If it's a native perennial, that's one of the wonderful things about native plants. They really don't need fertilizer. They absolutely don't need to be fertilized. I will put coffee grounds in the yard, and you can just dump your coffee grounds out like around your plants, and it looks okay. I mean, they're dark, and it just looks like good soil, and it rapidly turns into good soil. You can put down leaf mulch, and that decomposes. If you've got a source of compost, I'd put compost on the perennials, but you do not need to fertilize. The only exception to that is that when you plant bulbs, and your daffodils and crocuses are not native plants, when you plant your bulbs, you want to get some of that commercial fertilizer and put it in the hole that you've dug for the bulb. And then every year you do want to fertilize your bulbs again. And when you buy the fertilizer, it'll tell you when to use it. And that's probably something that I have trouble doing, is remembering to fertilize my bulbs. Okay, next. How to start perennials. Most perennials should be planted in the fall. Plant them now, because they'll have time to get their roots well established before winter. If you're planting bulbs, you need to plant them now in the fall. Again, they get their roots established so that they're ready to pop up in the spring. Now, a lot of people find this really, really crazy, but if you're growing perennials from seeds, you want to plant the seeds now, because they need that cold, wet winter. They need to be snowed on, they need to be frozen, they need all that before they'll germinate. You can't take native Virginia native plants and plant the seed in the spring. You got to plant it in the fall. Think about it. They grow, they throw down their seeds at the end of the summer or in the fall, and then the seeds germinate. And we're just going to mimic nature and plant those seeds. I like to plant my seeds in some kind of container, like a window box, because otherwise, when they come up in the spring, just in a garden, I might not recognize what they are. Those tiny little leaves, when they first come up, you don't know what they are. They could be a weed. So I like to keep them in like a window box. And then when they come up in the spring, they're all together, you recognize them, and then you divide them and put them out. Some people just like to put them out. It's a matter of style, and I guess I'm a bit of a control freak, so I like to know where my plants are. And then there are some plants, especially mints, any flower like bee balm that's in the mint family, you can root a cutting, but you need to do that in the early summer. I'm trying right now to root some hyssop, and I just took the cutting a couple weeks ago. They're still sitting in water. They haven't rooted yet. They haven't died, but they haven't rooted yet. Oh, everything. Everything that you would grow from seed. Milkweed, coneflower, the coreopsis. And I buy the seeds online because you can't readily buy them in the stores right now. Your garden shops and a lot of places where you might buy your plants, they appeal to your instant gratification. So they want to sell you plants that are currently in bloom, or they want to sell you flower vegetables or annual seeds in the spring. So you need to go online, and I've got a list of resources that are available to you where you go and get your seeds. So actually, any native plant the seeds can be planted now. Because normally they would be dropping their seeds now. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Perennials, if you want to plant a new perennial garden, it's expensive. Perennials are expensive because growers spend a lot of time growing them to mature plants to sell. And so you go to buy a cone flower, and it could be anywhere from $6 to $20 for one plant. And so if you want a flower bed full of them, that's just a lot to pay. Some of the strategies that you can use is to buy one and buy it now, look for sales. Right now, places like Lowe's and Home Depot, and even some of the garden centers are putting their perennials on sale. Shop around, look carefully, and get a few, and then maybe you want to also say you want to establish a bed of coneflowers. You buy a few, you buy some seeds, um, and then if you have some friends who have them, they may be ready to divide some, and they want to offer you a few. And we're going to look at some slides of how you divide them. Now, if someone offers you iris tubers, definitely take them. If someone offers you daffodil bulbs, very often people dig up their bulbs once they're spent, and if they give you some small, weak daffodil bulbs, they really aren't worth planting, because the green, the foliage will come up, but they won't bloom. So look for sales now in places like Costco and Home Depot and Lowe's for your daffodil bulbs. I wouldn't spend a whole lot of money. I don't spend a whole lot of money on them. I mean, you can go to these fancy bulb places, but I don't do that. And my daffodils are fine. You just want to get big bulbs. Okay, I think I talked about cuttings. You get them earlier in the year to try to root them. Seeds you buy online. Yes, you want to transplant the daffodil bulbs in your yard now. True confessions, I have planted daffodil bulbs as late as December, and they came up okay, but that's probably not optimal. You should plant those bulbs now, buy them and plant them or move them around. Okay, next. Okay, so this is an example of thinning. I was looking in Home Depot, and they had this big pot of coneflowers. You see a picture of the pot on the right. They're pretty colors, and I think it was something like $18.99. But when you look at it, we kind of move things aside and look, there were at least 4 separate plants. So then you think, well, that's just a little bit over $4. Well, I don't divide very well. Okay. It's like $4.50 a plant. So that's not bad. Let's look at the next slide. All right, so I pulled them out of the pot, and they're not very root bound. Sometimes if perennials have been in a pot for a couple of years, they're just massively full of roots, and you have to get out your serrated butcher knife to cut them apart. But these were not very root bound, so they will be easier to separate. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, so I separated these, and I got four plants. Now, one of them was really big, and if I had been a little bit more aggressive, that one on the far left, there might have been more than one crown that I could separate out, but I might have lost some of the plants. So I just kept that one together. I said, I'm not going to be greedy. 4 is a good one. And that 4th little one on the right, there wasn't a whole lot of root and soil there, but I potted it up separately, and it's doing just fine. It's in a pot. I haven't put it in the soil yet. And the other 3, actually, I put back in the pot because I was leaving on vacation, and I was afraid I wouldn't be able to water them enough. You really do need to water the plants well and keep a close eye on them. So, okay, suppose someone says, I've got coneflowers and my plants are too close together. You can come and get some of them. You might want to dig up a big chunk of them and separate them. Give the person back, fill that big hole that you created, and by giving them back a plant or two, and then you keep the other plants. So this sort of idea of digging up, having a big clump and separating them, you can use that when you buy a big pot, and you can also use that same kind of strategy when you're taking plants out of someone's garden. You want to be considerate and careful with their plants so they invite you back the next year to dig out some more. So there's some strategies of sort of digging up a big chunk, looking it over, separating it, putting some back in the garden, and then keeping some. Okay, next. Okay, we're done. Okay, we ran over a little bit. Questions. What are the questions that we have? So yes, it's time to transplant daffodils.
I think one of the questions, Carol, was what kind of soil? One of the questions was, what kind of soil do you use? I think specifically the question was about geraniums.
If I were, there's a native perennial geranium that's just lovely, and you can just put that in your native Virginia clay. When you've got clay, I like to try to break it up, put some leaf mulch in there. They usually advise against amending the soil with bags and bags of soil that you've purchased. But I do like to try to work in some leaf mulch. And if the soil is really, really hard, I would get just the very cheapest topsoil that you can buy. And that's much better than clay. If you're putting them in pots, I would just get any good potting soil. It needs drainage. You can't use topsoil. You can't use soil out of your garden because when you've got plants in a pot, it's very important that you've got good drainage. Got to have holes in the bottom of the pot, and that water's got to drain out because otherwise you'll kill the plant by having them in wet soil.
Well, thank you so much, Carol, for all of your great information. I shared with you before that this is not an area that I do well with gardening, but I always enjoy learning and then trying it. So I think you gave some great tips and recommendations for our participants today. And so today we did talk about a number of different things, just understanding how to cut some costs in landscaping and creating a beautiful garden that will just give new life year after year. And how to do that by thinking about how long and when some of those perennials will bloom. I think that was a great tip. Might require some research, but there are people like the master gardeners and others who may be able to add insight to that, which I think is wonderful.
Okay, I have two. Can I say something about that? There was an African violet question.
Sure.
I have struggled with African violets for years. Good light. I have them under a timer and grow lights, and I have finally given up on some of those African violet soil mixes. I think good drainage is the most important thing. And now I've got this terrarium soil and the water just runs right through it. And I'm not losing them like I always used to lose them. I also want to invite everybody to come out to the Master Gardener demonstration garden at Ida Lee. It's back, it's next to the community gardens. and it's open to the public anytime the sun is up. So come and see what we're doing. We've got lots of perennials, we've got vegetables, we've got a little bit of everything.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Carol, for that and the invitation. And I believe we have some resources that you've prepared for our participants today that we're sharing a link to that resource. So if you have some more questions, please do follow up. We've put into the chat the Loudon Master Gardeners website and email and these resources for you. So we are so glad to be able to answer so many questions during our presentation. And thank you, Carol, for sharing your knowledge with us. We do want to invite you to join us for our next Learning Center webinar with the Tools for Life. We're going to be, our next topic will be very interesting on October 14th. We're going to be talking about some very common problems and simple solutions that occur with a toilet. How fun is that? We all have these problems that come up, and some simple solutions that you can handle in addressing those problems. So we hope that you'll join us in the next session on October 14th. Thank you once again for joining us. Have a great afternoon.